Hi everyone, welcome to this new session of our webinar dedicated to higher education and the major trends, foresight approach about higher education. It's my colleague Corinne, with the head of our foresight unit, who will give you a glimpse and perhaps more about a very important topic that is the impact of the pandemic on the student mobility. So thank you everyone for being with us. And Corinne, you are in Paris, but also in the air. The floor is yours.
I'm a lot in the air actually, but that's more of a mental thing than anything else these days. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. As Francois just said, I'm going today to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international student mobility at global level. That'll be my first part, so I'm stating out my outline very quickly, and it's very simple. It's got roughly two parts. One will be to address directly the impacts that the pandemic has had on international student mobility at global level. And then I will take a look with you at the possible longer-term effects that the changes brought about by the pandemic, but in the context of trends that were already developing prior to the pandemic, may have on this particular dimension of higher education. I'd like to start with a quick overview of where international student mobility was standing on the eve of the pandemic. I would like to start also, first of all, by saying that it's worth noting that the trend towards student mobility had been expanding consistently for about 20 years prior to the pandemic. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I have a few, not very many, but a few slides. All right, so this is the chart that I wanted to start with. This shows you, I don't know where to put this so it's not in the way, but okay. The source is Project Atlas. These are figures from 2020. I don't know to what extent you're going to be able to see everything, but you can see here a distribution of host countries, of leading host countries, or main host countries, over the past 20 years, roughly from 2000 to 2020. With the color codes, as you can see, the US has had the lion's share, still does, but you can see there's been it's been a decreasing share over that period, followed by the UK, which has also decreased over that period. And then in third position is Canada, which has grown in its share of international student enrollment. Interestingly, from the early 2010s, you can also see the emergence of China as a destination country. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is because I'm going to go back to the subject of China in my second part. In fact, in the concluding part of a segment of my second part, okay? So this is the overall picture, the overall context in which we're talking about student mobility. As you all know, student mobility has been a pillar, as well as the most visible part of the internationalization process of higher education, process that's been developing since the 1990s. It's not the only dimension of internationalization, but student mobility has definitely been the most advertised, the more monitored, the more written about dimension of internationalization during that period. It's worth, of course, mentioning the other components of internationalization that are much less scrutinized, which are academic mobility, the increasing convergence of higher education systems, of degree recognition processes, and more recently, over roughly the past 15 years, decade and a half, the export of programs the export of institutions, and of course, research collaboration involving actors, sometimes in multiple countries. The second point I want to emphasize to situate what I'm going to say when I get to the subject of the pandemic and its impact is the extent to which, up until 2 years ago, international students had become a major source of revenue for a growing number of colleges and universities across the developed world, but in particular in North America, in Australia, and in the United Kingdom. This is because in those countries, unlike domestic students, international students have to pay full tuition. And in fact, they're also charged higher fees in state-funded universities across Europe. So by and large, international students tend to pay much higher tuition fees than local students, than national students. And so it's been a real financial boon for many universities in host countries. It's become basically a lucrative operation, really for multiple institutions. And as COVID-19 began to rapidly sweep across the world in early 2020, these institutions that depended to a great extent on the income from international enrollment suddenly found themselves deprived of this manna, you might say. And this transformation, in other words, the increasing reliance of a growing number of institutions on revenue from international students, coincided with a steady overall decrease in public funding of colleges and universities, in particular in those Anglo-Saxon countries that became the prime destination for international students from other regions of the world. And of course, the two phenomena are not coincidental. They developed in parallel. They're of course interconnected. The more state funding decreased for institutions of higher learning, and the more many of them found a substitute source of income in increased international enrollment. This was the situation, the broad situation prior to the pandemic. As the pandemic caused one country after another to close borders and international travel virtually came to a halt early into the pandemic, it began to dawn on many actors in the sector that perhaps some institutions of higher learning, at least, had become too reliant on this source of income. For example, in Canada, this was a major issue during the first phase of the pandemic. In Canada, where public funding of universities dropped from 80 to less than 50% in just a decade and a half, or roughly 2 decades, observers began to call the dependence of some Canadian universities, for example, McGill, for example, Concordia, among others, on international student income, a national addiction, while noting that for these institutions, the ones I just mentioned, international student fees alone had covered the entire increase in their operating budgets of the past decade. Okay, so you get the picture. In a nutshell, international student mobility prior to the pandemic had become a thriving business, really, for a number of destination countries. That means that complete with an growing array of corporate actors acting as matchmakers between prospective students and universities for significant fees, increasingly significant fees. In other words, the whole thing started to look like a market, like a commercial market. And this larger context that I'm pointing out here is important to keep in mind in order to understand the huge impact that the loss of international student revenue has caused by the pandemic, has had on many institutions in the developed world, and in particular in leading host countries, as you see them on this chart. In Britain, for example, the decline in international enrollments by the end of 2020, it's important to point out that figures are very much related to specific phases of the pandemic, and then they vary. We see that at the end, for example, for the UK, we see that the impact is overall impact is not negative at all. But if we look at the early impact, I think I have figures in the next slide. I can get to it. Okay, we're gonna have a little problem here. Oh, okay, sorry, I skipped that. I also wanted to show you this, which relates to the introduction I just finished. Okay, I just wanted to show you the growth of international student mobility prior to the pandemic. 6.1 million students worldwide, 2019, so twice the number for the year 2007, with a 5.5% average annual increase between 1998 and 2019. These are OECD figures. And then in the chart below, moving this thing around so you can see, and moving this too. These are UNESCO sources. You can see the growth between 98 and 2018 from 2.2 million to 5.6 million. Okay, so a huge industry. I think the word is correct. To call it an industry is probably not a mischaracterization. This is very annoying, but we'll have to live with it. I wanted to show you early figures in losses. Okay, this is, I have to say I had a huge problem with my slides as I was going through them to make a final check just before I was going to go on air, as François said. And I've had to scramble to put them back together. They might not be in the right order. So I will ask you to bear with me. Yeah, this should definitely be the second slide, but it happens to be the fourth. UK, you can see early impact 2020, 30 to 50% drop altogether, and now stabilized. And even by some accounts, even though final statistics are not out yet for the year 2021, it would seem that there's been actually an increase, an overall increase of 11%. And that would be because in the case of the UK, that would be because British universities in particular deployed tremendous efforts to enroll international students and keep those already enrolled in the UK during the first phase of the pandemic. And of course, the vaccination campaign that deployed very early there was also a factor. In the US, as you can see, the overall figure was 43% in spring 2020. Altogether, the loss amounted to 15% for that academic year, 2020-2021, compared to the previous year, but with a notable 46% drop, it's not on the slide, for newly enrolled international students, which is absolutely huge and absolutely unprecedented, of course, for the US, first destination, first host country for international students. And this came after already the drop that you saw in the previous chart, okay, that has been occurring over a period of 20 years. It's documented here as well in this chart. I'm going to move this thing again. As you can see, new international student enrollment. This is only new international student enrollment, okay? But you can see a considerable drop starting already from 2015-16, where it reached a peak with a kind of sharp decrease and then a kind of plunge from 2017. So the past 4 years, or the 4 years prior to the pandemic, roughly 3-4 years, saw really the sharpest decline since the declining trend began some 20 years ago in the US, correlated, according to many accounts, to Donald Trump's perceived inhospitable attitude, shall we say, toward international student exchange. I want to now take a broader look at how the pandemic has affected student mobility overall, okay? And the first notable fact is that it has affected credit mobility more than it has affected degree mobility. In other words, it has more significantly affected undergraduate students who go abroad for a semester as part of their study programs than it has international students enrolled at a university for a full degree. And that's, of course, for understandable reasons, because students enrolled for a full degree, which is usually 3 to 4 years, were already there and already into the program by the time that the pandemic began to develop, whereas undergraduate students that are scheduled to go for a semester and had been scheduled to go for a semester is usually the spring semester. The pandemic, of course, began in the early spring semester of 2020. So this category of student was a lot more affected. In addition to that, another noteworthy fact is that most universities have offered, as a reaction, of course, to the pandemic, in terms of managing the crisis with international students, most universities have offered international students already enrolled but unable to attend in person the possibility to study remotely. That was, of course, 99% of the time the solution that was offered. Now, this was the case, of course, for local students as well. Since we're focusing on international students, I want to point out that multiple surveys have showed that this has proved to be a poor substitute for the real thing, with many student respondents in those surveys saying that if they had a choice between studying face-to-face at home at a local university or online, still at home but online at a foreign institution, then they would prefer to study at a local university, but in person. I think the ratio in the leading surveys that were conducted during that early phase of the pandemic, roughly most surveys were conducted from September 2020. The ratio was 2/3. 2/3 of students roughly responded that they would prefer to enroll in person at a local university rather than online at an international or foreign university abroad. Beyond this global picture, the pandemic has had very different effects on student mobility on the whole. I'm looking at the overall situation now worldwide, depending on students, one, country of origin, and two, their host country. Part of what accounts for that is the diversity in travel restrictions enforced by different countries. Ranging, for example, from Australia, that put in place a very strict and prolonged travel ban, to, on the other end of the spectrum, Germany, where the travel ban was short. And even during the short travel ban, special permits were quickly made available to foreign students, roughly from May or June 2020. And of course, I mentioned earlier the effort that British universities also deployed to get international students to come back, even in the midst of the pandemic. Okay, so there's a great diversity in the way that host countries dealt with the pandemic. The measures that they put in place, the severity of the travel bans, etc. And that, of course, had a very diverse, different impact on student mobility, depending on the host country. Another crucial factor was the diversity in the measures implemented in the students' home countries. Of course, you have this phenomenon happening on both sides. For example, China and India differed significantly in their handling of the pandemic, with, as you know, China sealing off its borders very early on and very strictly, but India being much laxer on the whole. Why mention these two countries in particular? Because these two countries together supply a very significant chunk of international students in the West, in Europe and North America, for example, representing respectively 35% of international students in the United States, 35% of international students in the US are from China, and 80% of international students in the US are from India, okay? Now, international enrollment is picking up again. This academic year, it has picked up again with the spread of vaccination, in particular in host countries, with travel restrictions being gradually lifted. Nevertheless, projections, what will happen in the near future, it's of course probably too early to tell. It's certainly too early to tell what medium-term impact the pandemic will have on international student mobility. What I can say is that by most estimates, if no terrible new variant emerges, let's put it that way, and things continue to get back to a sort of normal that would be largely comparable to the pre-pandemic situation, we should see student mobility, one, resume over the next year or two to reach pretty much its pre-pandemic level. Some observers even say that there will be a sort of pent-up effect of students having been frustrated during the pandemic because they were not able to travel, they were not able to go to universities abroad, that the desire, the demand will even increase compared to pre-pandemic levels. This is all speculation, of course. We're still in many ways in the middle of the pandemic, depending on where in the world, but we're definitely not out of it yet. But most estimations project for the next year or 2 years a picture in which we see more or less a return to pre-pandemic situations with more or less the same patterns in terms of origin and destination countries, okay? Now, estimates that address the longer term prospects suggest a dramatically altered landscape a decade from now. And that is what I would like to conclude my talk with. First of all, one lasting overall impact of the pandemic in higher education, I'm saying in higher education as a whole, as a sector, not just international students, will have been to demonstrate how easy it is, how easy it was when called for by the situation to transfer classes online. And this was in contrast with the vast reluctance to do so, to transfer massively online that had characterized the higher education sector in this respect prior to the pandemic. It is likely that this will foster broader acceptance of online and hybrid learning in the future. We can already see it happen, even though, despite the fact that the pandemic is not over yet. And there's no doubt that this is going to affect higher education substantially in years to come. This is a subject I have addressed and will address again in some of my publications. It's not our subject today, it's related, but it's not the core subject. Regarding student mobility, the rise of remote learning is also bound to have an impact. I've already said online learning, same for national students and international students, does not seem to be the preferred way, seems to be a poor substitute in students' views, and in particular, of course, for international students, for the experience of living and studying abroad for understandable reasons. But you have to take into account the fact that the remote option, if it develops, and it certainly will, because it's already developing, will make it possible to recruit entirely new segment of student populations across the world. in particular, student populations who simply can't afford to go abroad and study, okay? Even with financial help, even with a scholarship for tuition, you still have to take into account the cost of traveling, the cost of living, room and board there, etc. And of course, that it is beyond reach for entire student population segments, that the spread of online, the spread of remote learning will certainly be able to attract. So observers point to the prospect of potentially larger cohorts of students gaining international experiences in the coming years in less traditional ways. This is sometimes called transnational, no longer international, but transnational education, meaning that it is going to be the education rather than the student that is going to become mobile. Not just via online learning, although of course this is going to be a massive phenomenon, but also through branch campuses that students will increasingly join in their home countries. Okay, this is one factor that comes across in most forecasts, okay, in most studies, in most projections over, say, the next 1, 2 to 5 years, roughly. I would like to conclude with another possibly very significant factor that is perhaps a little bit longer term, and it's the increasing number of forecasts that predict that by 2030, roughly in less than a decade, most of the world's higher education activity altogether will have moved to Asia, to the Asian continent. There's a growing number of studies pointing in that direction, but there's in particular a study by Study Portals, which is a search platform for international students, showing that there are now 17,000, it's an impressive figure, 17,000 offerings of degree programs in English in non-Anglophone countries, compared to about 500 in the early 2000s. I think I have these figures going back. Yeah, you have them there. With Dubai, as you can see, Dubai, Malaysia, Singapore, and in particular China, indeed becoming leading regional destinations for student mobility. Now, regional meaning at continent level, okay? Limited to the Asian continent right now. And I want to finish with a particular emphasis on China. Since 2010, as you saw in the previous chart that I show you, China begins to appear as a host destination country for international students from the early 2010s on. Since 2010, China has been pursuing assertive policies aimed at expanding its reach and market influence in global higher education, with the objective of becoming the largest study abroad destination in Asia. This is a goal that's become part of the Belt and Road Initiative roughly in the mid 2010s. And it, as a stated objective, it was actually achieved, it was actually reached in 2017-18. How did China do this? It it deployed, of course, a concerted, very active policy of attracting international students by offering them more flexible testing and greater access to elite universities and scholarships than it does to its own students, than it does to domestic students. Overall, the number of international students, you can see that's the third item on the slide, enrolled in degree programs in China increased by more than 350% in a little over a decade, between 2006 and 2018. So an aggressive outreach on the part of China, which will evidently resume in China's post-pandemic context. And even though the ambition right now is still limited to the Asian continent, which is already an enormous deal, I think this should be of the utmost relevance to the colleges and universities of leading host countries, in other words, in the West, US, North America, etc., in particular US, UK, Australia, simply because Asian students have formed the bulk of their international enrollments for decades now. Okay, most of the income, in other words, comes from the Asian continent. So if China succeeds in replacing, this is over time, of course, we're looking at the next decade, perhaps even a little more than that. But if China and other countries, for example, Singapore in this respect is talked about a lot. But if China alone succeeds in replacing those Western universities with a growing appeal to Asian students, then the consequence for traditionally leading host countries will be that, this may mean for them that the entire rationale between their international student recruitment model, the model that they have cultivated for the past 2-3 decades or more, even 4 decades, we're going about that far, that model may soon have to be entirely redesigned. And I would like to conclude with that. Now, that's speculation. I'm talking about 10 years from now, roughly. It's not a guarantee, but my job is not to give guarantees on what will happen 10 years from now, but just to point out likely trends, probable trends. So this is definitely something to watch. That's it for me. Thank you for your attention.